Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll start if you'll all please take your seats. Thanks so much for coming out on this rather warm day. Here it's a little cooler. I'm Orville Schell, and I'm the Arthur Ross Director here at the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. And tonight's really, it's a wonderful occasion for me. Not only have I been a reader of the New York Review of Books for 50 years, but have written for them. And I have to say that the coverage of China that they have run over the years has really been incredible. And I was just reading a piece in the plane today, another reminder of so many books get written, go unsung, and it's nice to see somebody who actually is still involved in reviewing books in a thoughtful and interesting way. Now, this occasion arose because the Asia Society and our center has formed a partnership with the New York Review to take all of the writing that they've done on China, which is voluminous, by some of the most wonderful people over the decades. And we were launching a new website ourselves called China File, which will cover all aspects of China and the U.S.-China relation, from video to photography to book reviews to reports to news to social media, art, culture. And we have all of these articles in repose in one archive available to all of you, and they are searchable. And so it's a nice thing for us to be able to sort of celebrate that partnership and also to celebrate the review. To introduce our evening, I'm pleased to welcome Hugh Eakin, who is the senior editor at the New York Review, and he will talk a little bit about the panel and introduce our panelists. Hugh?
Thank you, Orville. On behalf of the New York Review of Books and our publisher, Ray Hederman, it's a very special occasion to be here tonight for this important discussion about the stability of China and the transfer of power this fall. We'll be hearing from several of the most astute experts thinking and writing about China today, experts whom we at the New York Review have also been lucky enough to have in our pages. Along with our special guests, this group, of course, includes our host, Orville Schell himself, who, as many of you know, has published very widely on China, including for the New York Review of Books. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to make a special mention of the New York Review's editor and co-founder, Robert Silvers, who would have very much liked to have been here this evening, but is on his way to Oslo for another New York Review event. Bob has had an enduring, passionate interest in China over many, many years, and I think this has been reflected in our pages, which, without sounding too grand, I'd like to say have sometimes been an active part of unfolding events in China. And I'll just give one or two examples here to give you an idea of what I mean. I think many of you are familiar with the review. Fang Lizhe, the great physicist and moral voice and dissident who died this spring, had a very long relationship with the New York Review. Characteristically, he became sort of a household name in the United States after Tiananmen Square. But Bob had long before known of him, heard about him, and published a major piece by him in the very first months of 1989. So review readers were already well aware of him at the time he became a kind of world figure. And another more recent example, Charter 08, this courageous document, a democracy document that was penned by Liu Xiaobo and others in the final months of 2008, the review published it in English in real time, more or less as it came out in Chinese. And this document, of course, was one of the reasons that Liu Xiaobo was then charged with subversion, and also cited in his being awarded the Nobel Prize. But more than that, perhaps, is the continual coverage the review has devoted to China in almost every issue. Over the years, the review has sought out the most authoritative thinkers, writers, journalists to write about China and the key and urgent questions it has presented and continues to present to the United States and the world. Which brings me to our guests tonight, Roderick McFarquhar and Ian Johnson. From very different backgrounds, both of these remarkable writers and thinkers, I think, exemplify the New York Review's particular approach to analyzing and writing about the world. And what I mean, it's what you might call bringing journalistic clarity to deep scholarship and scholarly rigor to long-form journalism. Let me start with Professor McFarquhar from Harvard University. Having had his own early career in journalism, he went on to found China Quarterly, the leading scholarly journal of its kind. And then, in his own groundbreaking scholarship, established himself as one of our foremost historians of the Chinese Communist Party and the world's leading authority on the Cultural Revolution. And amid all this, after writing the first volume of a definitive 3-volume account of the Cultural Revolution, he somehow found time to be elected to and to serve in the British Parliament. He has contributed to the New York Review of Books since the 1980s, analyzing, I believe, more than one transfer of power in our pages that has taken place in China. His most recent works include Mao's Last Revolution, which he wrote together with Michael Schoenholz, a spectacularly thorough 1-volume account of the Cultural Revolution. And he's just edited a new 3rd edition of The Politics of China, a classic history of the entire sweep of communist rule in China, a standard reference for several generations of students, I think, and I include myself. So let's welcome Professor McFarquhar. And with him tonight, arrived from Beijing just a few days ago, is our other guest, Ian Johnson. He will be well known to many of you for his intrepid reporting on China. He wrote for many years for the Wall Street Journal, where he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. You may have seen recently some of his occasional front-page stories for the New York Times, where he now contributes to their China coverage from time to time. And I'm happy to say he now writes frequently for the New York Review of Books, where he has become our own one-man Beijing bureau. What you may not know is that Ian also has extensive scholarly training as well. He was a student in China in the 1980s and then obtained an advanced degree in sinology at the Free University of Berlin before becoming a China hand himself. You can see this in his meticulous and deep reporting on the emergence of civil society in China. This was the subject of his first book, Wild Grasses. And you can also see it in the remarkable series of articles, book reviews, interviews, and dispatches he has done for the New York Review and for our new online journal, the NYR blog. In recent months, he's been following closely the Bo Xilai scandal, which he did a remarkable and penetrating analysis in our pages earlier this spring. And he's been interviewing a remarkable array of figures about the current political situation and all the uncertainty going into this fall's transfer of power. So let us welcome Ian Johnson. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Orville and our guests.
Well, thanks, gents, for being here. Let's maybe start with this question. I think we're witnesses to one of the truly great experiments of human history, of a country that's been trying to reinvent itself, really for the last century. Do you both think that China has an evolved notion of where it's going? Maybe let's start with you, Rod, because you've been really watching this for quite a while.
I think they have a very strong idea of the kind of destination which they have been working towards, with enormous setbacks for well over a century, as you said. And ever since the return to power of Deng Xiaoping at the end of the 70s, the objective has been development, 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 with the aim, which patriots right back through the decades into the 19th century also had, the aim of China restoring its greatness so it no longer would be the plaything of foreign powers. And I think that what they have done over the last 30 years is what many of the communist leaders would like to have seen them do in the previous years under Mao, when they had many disasters, and that is to show the world that this is a country which will not be poor. It's going to take a long time for all 1 billion plus to come out of the poverty line, but it will not be poor, it will not be weak, and the rest of the world better accept that fact that there's a new player in the world game.
All right, I want to turn to you, Ian, but flag that for a minute, because if that goal is even partially accomplished, I'd like to get your thoughts about then what's next. But Ian, how do you respond to that general question?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think the problem that they're facing, and where I think the roadmap is sort of run out, is we know where we want to go, and the current leadership is building some of the trappings of this, say, on a military level, force projection to be some sort of a great power, soft power through Confucius Institutes and things like that. But there's still a feeling, which I think is accurate, that these are still sort of superficial, and there's a taking of these trappings of the outward forms of being a great power without having the real ability to do it. And I think that the people in China still have this feeling that they're not there yet, and they aren't really sure how to take the next step. I think there's a tremendous amount of gridlock in China, to use the American term.
I would agree with your sense of uncertainty among the leaders, but I don't think it's to do with the fact that they don't know how to get stronger militarily or economically. I think the real problem is they don't know what a modernized China will be about. It's not going to be Confucian. It's not going to be Marxist-Leninist. What is it going to be about? There's no there. And this is something which the leadership have acknowledged, in the sense that they have said, we do not know quite how to relate to the people sometimes. Because in the days of Confucianism, in the days of Marxism-Leninism, whether you liked it or not, there was a relationship. It was not merely a political doctrine, it was a social doctrine as well. And it bound government, leaders, and people together, whether they liked it or not. So you knew what China meant. They don't know what China means now.
So, Rod, if the first act, in a certain sense, was the quest for wealth and power, and if perhaps we are actually coming up against some line of history, and I think there's many reasons to feel that at some point we either are or will, then what is the next act?
It's difficult to say what the next act is when the leadership of China doesn't seem to know. So it's a little bold for us to walk in. But I think that the next act has to be a realization that leaders and led in China, like in any other country, have to have a basis of trust and a basis of empowerment in the part of the people. I'm not suggesting that they have to go to democratic elections tomorrow, anything like that. But what I am saying is that they've got to find a way in which they can persuade the people of China that despite all the corruption, and the government, the party is terribly corrupt, despite all the damage to the environment, which is enormous, Ian, I think, has written about this, that somehow the government is their government. At the moment, it's just the government. It's the leaders. It's them in Beijing, far away. It's not their government. They have no possession of that government, like they have no possession of any ideas which link them to that government. And the next step has to be for them to find a way to get that relationship if they can.
And they talk about it enough. I mean,
Yes.
they talk constantly about political reform, and this always gets journalists very excited. You know, as the Wen Jiabao will bring up political reform once a year or once every couple of years, and people will go, this means they're going to reevaluate Tiananmen Square and the whole thing. But I think they don't really know what they mean by it.
They know what they don't mean by it.
They know what they don't mean by it. Well, they have a vague idea that it'll be a little more, somehow a little more responsive. There'll be some means for the citizenry to have some input, some feedback, but there isn't, I don't think, anything more than that. There isn't really any sense.
And yet, traditionally speaking, one can't say that was an incredible compact between the people and the government, that the government ruled and the people were ruled. So why this sudden craving now?
Because they've been opened up to the outside world over the last 30 years in a way that they hadn't been for 3,000. They are now aware of how other people live. They are aware that other countries, they may not want to live there, but that there are other ways of governing. There are ways in which you don't feel worried that the police are going to take you away because they don't like the art that you've just done. And the world has been opened up. And the government, as you well know, Orville, attempts to prevent many things getting through. And every time they do something to the internet, the hackers find a way around it.
So in effect, bourgeois spiritual pollution, which was always an issue, has actually come to pass.
Yes. And they did it themselves. Deng Xiaoping did it by opening up.
And a few flies came in.
Right.
A whole lot.
Does it surprise you two that things have been as durable as they have been? I mean, I remember being in Beijing in 1989, standing during the middle of the demonstrations in that traffic kiosk in front of Mao's portrait and thinking, they're never going to get this back in the bottle. And they did. And they've had a pretty good run.
They got it back in the box in one sense and not in another sense. The mothers of the sons who were killed, or daughters who were killed at Tiananmen, have never given up. And Tiananmen is not going to be forgotten. I mean, if I had advice for the new leader of China, it'd be the same advice I gave to Hu Jintao. And that is, he should do three things and be absolutely wonderful for him. He should redress the verdicts on Tiananmen, and all the intellectuals would be behind him. He would, he'd let in the Dalai Lama so that he'd be a bird in a gilded cage in Tibet, and he'd have Richard Gere off his back. And he would take one senior leader or family and have them up for corruption, not for some political device as they have done in the past. And then the whole of China would back him.
And did he take your advice, Rod?
Nor do I expect Xi Jinping to do it either.
Well, this has been a long historical problem, hasn't it, of Western advice not being very readily absorbed or received.
Well, they're a long-lived and proud civilization. Why should they take our advice?
But I think this advice would come from a lot of Chinese people.
I'm
So
sure.
I don't think it would just be, you know, I think you're right on Tiananmen. I think that's one issue that would be probably impossible for the government to do right now, but it's something that they could do and gain a lot. But the corruption, I don't think that would do it. I don't think taking a member of the standing committee, and essentially they may be doing this with Bo Xilai. We don't know how that's going to play out. There could be corruption that's part of charges against him. But people know that it's more than just one person, that the system is endemically corrupt because there are no checks and balances, however you want to formulate the checks and balances, that the system itself leads to absolute corruption, and practically everybody in the system at any level is corrupt to some degree.
And yet, it has led to an incredible 2 decades of growth and a certain amount of legitimacy that have come out of that growth. It's a curious compact with the people. But does that have a shelf life that's...
I think the compact has been a different one. After Tiananmen, I think the compact was, you can say and think what you like, just don't go to Tiananmen Square and denounce the government or try to form a party or Charter 08 or whatever it is against the Communist Party. You can get on with what you're doing and we'll try our best to make you rich. So I think that was the compact. And as the coastal areas have got rich and as that riches spread slowly inland, people are going to be accepting of the way things are. That's why the country is, as Li Peng once said in a interview that I was part of, the country is in a state of extreme stability.
That's always want to put a flag up whenever the word extreme appears. So, Ian, how do you explain the last 20 years? And have you been surprised, or do you think it's all predictable?
Well, you see, of course, all the low-level local protests, the reports that there are over 100,000 or 150,000 mass incidents every year. But the economic growth paves over a lot of cracks. And I think for a lot of people, life has gotten a lot better. And there are opportunities that have opened up for so many people that they're willing to overlook a lot of the problems in society. So in essence, the government's compact has worked, but I think long-term, you do have this kind of modernization dilemma where you get more players who are active in society, you have a better educated population. It's not an iron law that it's going to happen with a certain amount of per capita GDP, but I think that you do see this at the local level and at small towns and where people are becoming, they want more of a say over their life. Not necessarily I want to elect a person, but I just don't want this absolutely arbitrary form of government where I have almost no input and the craziest decisions can be made. I don't want that kind of a system. I think you get more and more people who feel that way. So.
And in fact, as a result of the trashing of the Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution at Mao's orders, you have people prepared, despite the power of the 80 million members of the party, prepared at a local level to stand up against local corrupt officials. We saw this in the village Wukan in Guangdong late last year. And the point is that no longer are people prepared to accept that the way things have always been done, the corrupt official does this and you say yes sir, no sir, they're not prepared to accept that if there's widespread pollution which causes damage to their children and they are thrown out of their houses in order to make way for a factory. It's just no longer acceptable. And I think it's now 500, Chinese academics estimated 500 incidents a day, which is about 180,000.
Yeah.
So then, to return to my earlier question, how do you explain that things have progressed over the last 2 decades plus now, as well as they have? Is this something that surprised you both?
What did Deng Xiaoping do? What Deng Xiaoping did was what Mao's revolution promised in 49 and didn't do. It was called the liberation. It wasn't. It was a straitjacketization. What Deng Xiaoping did was to liberate people in a limited sense, but economically, to work and earn money, to get rich was glorious. And the fact that people have been allowed to, on behalf of themselves, their families, to get richer, that has made for some stability. Because it may not be good for the country as a whole, but people all over are striving. And it's the industry of these people, I mean the industriousness of these people, working in Western factories, working in Taiwanese factories, working in Korean factories, working in Chinese factories, that has produced this miracle. And it's because they've been told it's no longer collectivization rules. You can make money, help your family. That's what can happen.
But I think there's also, to give the party some credit, the party has learned, or is able to learn and adapt over time. And if you look at a very controversial issue from 1999-2000, the crackdown on Falun Gong, with the absolute heavy-handed methods that were used to crush this, even if you believe that it was a religious cult, but completely out of proportion to the problem. And most human rights groups agree that up to 100 people were killed in police custody. So you don't have to accept all the Falun Gong stuff, but it was a pretty horrendous series of human rights abuses that lasted for a year. Now, when there are protests, you don't see such. There are, of course, cases of the police beating people to death and so on, but it's not to the same degree of brutality. And I think the party has gotten much more sophisticated in how they control dissent, the incredible expansion. And I'm not necessarily saying this is great, but it shows an adaptiveness. The growth in soft detention and those sort of things. And then if you look at the issue, people maybe turn to things like Falun Gong because there was a spiritual hunger. The established religions in China were very limited in scope, but Qigong, because it was not a religion, could essentially proselytize and grew around the country. The government cracked down on it, cut it down, and over the past decade or so, dozen years, has allowed the established religious groups to grow a lot faster than in the past. And I think this is partly a conscious decision on the government's part, that in essence, most of this spiritual hunger, it's not threatening to party rule as long as independent organizations don't grow up. So I think they are able to say, yeah, we can allow, for example, some religiosity in Chinese life that we didn't allow in the past, but we just don't want we don't want it to become politicized. And that's something that I didn't foresee, for example, in 99, 2000, when they cracked down on Falun Gong. So I think you can see in that and in other cases as well, where the party is able to some degree, adapt to changes.
I think that's true, Ian, at the top level. What I think is also the case is that the top levels have either lost control or turned their eyes in another direction with reference to the lower levels. And I think we see this with the blind lawyer Chan, now resident in this city. As long as economic development which deprives peasants of their land does not result in riots, with someone phoning Ian Johnson in Beijing and saying, there's a riot in my village, will you report it, please? As long as that doesn't happen, then the center is prepared to turn its eyes the other direction. And I think that the lower levels have not learned, because they don't need to learn. Because for the party at the top to do anything about the lower levels, both the corruption and the toughness with which they treat the local population, would require another cultural revolution. They're not going to launch that.
You know, there's a very interesting article in the New York Review of Books, it so happens, issued just before the one many of you have in your laps, reporting or reviewing a book that suggests, in effect, that one of the things that the Chinese leadership learned from the Cultural Revolution was a kind of a guerrilla pragmatism. Actually, within the rigidity of the system, an immense flexibility to do what has to be done to survive. And I wonder how you two respond to that.
I think what they learned most, and Ian's written about this, I think what they learned most was that in times of extreme chaos domestically, the only people you can depend on are your family. And I think that you've got to remember that when the communist regime was first set up in the 50s, the People's Daily would publish things, usually by bourgeois kids. I wish to draw a line between myself and my counter-revolutionary parents. This was very common at that time. And some of those kids took it seriously. At the time,
Bourgeois, evidently.
right. So that's what we're told. But in the case of the Cultural Revolution, you found that even your best friend might not be your best friend if he was in another Red Guard group. And the only people you could really rely upon were your family, if they were anywhere near, which sometimes they weren't.